Ever wondered why the older generation in your family refused to sit through certain films after dark? Why cinemas across America in the 1950s had to post medical staff at their own doors? While the horror of today buries you under rivers of digital gore and manufactured shock moments, the horror pictures of the 1950s operated on an entirely different level of menace. They found a way inside your mind and made themselves at home there permanently. These were not simply films. They were events that happened to people psychologically. One of these pictures set off a conversation among psychiatrists across the entire country about the nature of evil in children. Another drove a filmmaker into complete professional exile. One sent viewers walking out of cinemas genuinely suspicious that the strangers around them were not human. And one picture from France was linked to the deaths of 2 audience members from heart failure during a single showing in Paris. What follows is a countdown of the 11 most deeply unsettling horror pictures produced during the 1950s, and a number of them will leave you feeling disturbed about things you previously considered entirely ordinary. We begin at number 11. The Incredible Shrinking Man, released in 1957, is not the lightweight science fiction curiosity most people assume it to be. It is a film about existential annihilation wearing the costume of a creature feature, and it stands as one of the most psychologically crushing motion pictures ever placed on celluloid. Scott Carey comes into contact with a mysterious cloud of radioactive material and begins to shrink, steadily, without reversal, without remedy, without any reasonable hope. What the audience witnesses is not an adventure. It is the portrait of a human being watching his own sense of self erode centimeter by centimeter, while everything around him transforms into an alien and hostile landscape. The filmmakers, director Jack Arnold and novelist Richard Matheson, whose source material served as the foundation, produced something that the studio apparatus genuinely had no framework for releasing to the public. The threat in this film was not a creature descending on civilization from outside. The threat was civilization itself, expanding and indifferent, pressing down on a single man who was becoming too small to matter. When preview audiences saw the completed picture, they sat without making a sound rather than offering any reaction, genuinely uncertain whether they had witnessed a horror film or a profound human tragedy. A number of those viewers wrote letters directly to Universal Pictures asking whether the filmmakers had intended the story as dark comedy, because the only other interpretation available to them was simply too desolate to process. The sequence in this film that disturbs most deeply is not the celebrated confrontation with the spider. It is the quieter, smaller moment in which the wife of the shrinking man moves through the house with complete normalcy, placing objects on surfaces where her husband now lives, conducting her daily existence with total unawareness that the man she married is stranded in the space between her world and complete non-existence. That specific horror, the horror of being slowly erased from the awareness of someone who loves you, reached post-war American viewers somewhere that no conventional movie monster had ever managed to reach. Academic psychiatrists publishing in professional journals identified this film as the first widely seen motion picture to portray on screen what they described as identity dissolution anxiety. The American Film Institute subsequently placed it among the most intellectually significant science fiction films ever produced. Richard Matheson's original novel was described by Stephen King as the single most important work of horror fiction produced in the 20th century, and this film serves that source material faithfully. Arriving at number 10 is Them, from 1954. Dismissing this picture as a straightforward story about oversized ants would be a serious mistake, because Them is a far more deliberately constructed and far more unsettling piece of work than that description suggests. When nuclear weapons testing conducted in the desert of New Mexico causes ordinary ants to mutate into organisms the size of large vehicles, the film is not really presenting that development as a monster story. It is presenting it as a reckoning. The country responsible for splitting the atom is being forced to look directly at what that decision has produced. The ants are not the source of the horror. The source of the horror is the civilization that created the conditions for the ants to exist. Director Gordon Douglas assembled a production team that brought in actual professional entomologists to consult on the film, and that decision gave the finished picture a procedural and clinical quality that unsettled audiences in ways that straightforward fantasy could not have achieved. The film was not asking viewers to suspend disbelief and enter a fantasy world. It was suggesting to them that this was a foreseeable outcome. Government documents that were eventually made available to the public confirmed that officials at a federal level were asked to review the picture before its release, specifically to determine whether it carried a genuine risk of triggering public panic about the real consequences of atomic testing programs. The studio made adjustments as requested. The fact that a horror film required consultation with government officials before it could be released to the public communicates with considerable precision how seriously the premise was taken by people in positions of authority. The most disturbing single moment in them has nothing to do with the creatures themselves. It takes place inside a psychiatric facility, where a young girl who survived the opening attack sits in a state of complete psychological shutdown, unreachable and silent. When she finally returns to awareness and produces the single word that names what she witnessed, the effect on the audience carries more genuine dread than any physical spectacle the film offers. The performance delivered by James Whitmore as an officer of the state slowly arriving at a full understanding of what he is dealing with generates a particular quality of creeping horror that productions spending vastly larger sums of money consistently fail to reproduce. Gordon Douglas described the finished film as the production that left him genuinely frightened of scientific progress. It earned more than $2 million in its first month of release, and was subsequently selected for permanent preservation by the National Film Registry on the basis of its cultural importance. Number 9 is I Was a Teenage Werewolf from 1957, and setting aside any instinct to treat the title as an invitation to ridicule, it is worth understanding what this particular film actually accomplished within American culture. This is not a piece of campy drive-in entertainment. It is a precisely aimed piece of psychological horror built around a troubled young man named Tony who is subjected to experimental hypnotic regression therapy, and then deliberately activated into a state of violent regression by a physician operating from a framework of eugenicist ideology. The film's underlying argument is not subtle, and it was not arrived at accidentally. The director Gene Fowler Jr. and his writer created a picture that psychiatrists working at the time immediately identified as a pointed critique of behavioral modification techniques that were being applied to troubled young people in institutional settings across the country during that decade. The physician in this story has no intention of helping Tony. His interest is in using Tony's regression as a window into primitive human behavior, which means he is in practice subjecting a vulnerable young person to psychological destruction in service of his own intellectual curiosity. When community organizations raised objections to the film, their complaints focused entirely on the monster transformation sequences. Not one of those objections engaged with the actual horror the film was presenting, which was the figure in the laboratory coat holding the clipboard. Michael Landon's performance as Tony communicates genuine psychological anguish, and his transformation sequences read less as horror spectacle and more as documentation of a young person's mental collapse while the responsible adult observes and takes notes. The film recovered more than $2 million against a production cost of roughly $150,000, placing it among the most financially efficient horror productions of the entire decade. Roger Ebert subsequently argued that the film had never received the serious critical engagement it deserved as a work of American social horror that deployed the werewolf as a direct metaphor for what organized society does to the young people it cannot accommodate. At number 8 is The Fly from 1958, and the relevant film here is the original production rather than the celebrated later remake. This is a picture whose implications are so genuinely disturbing that audiences encountering it today still find themselves experiencing a form of physical discomfort they find difficult to name precisely. The scientist André Delambert undergoes a molecular fusion with a common housefly during an experiment in matter transportation, and what the film then presents is not simply a body horror scenario. It presents the specific nightmare of a highly intelligent human consciousness locked inside a form that is deteriorating and alien, watching its own disappearance while making increasingly desperate attempts to communicate its terror to the one person it cares about. The director Kurt Newman is reported to have wept during production of the final portion of the film, genuinely disturbed by the material he was responsible for bringing into existence. The studio was sufficiently uncertain about how the picture should conclude that 3 separate versions of the ending were assembled and tested on preview audiences, all of which produced significant distress in the people watching. One of those versions was withdrawn from consideration entirely after members of preview audiences reported experiencing nausea that persisted for days following the screening. The version that was ultimately released was the least extreme of the 3 options. The sequence in this film that carries the greatest disturbing power is not the celebrated moment when the transformed head is revealed to the audience, though that moment did produce documented fainting in multiple theaters. The sequence that truly disturbs is the one in which the character of Helene, played by Patricia Owens, sits calmly at a loom and explains in complete detail to police officers exactly how she killed her husband by placing him inside an industrial press. Her voice carrying no emotional inflection whatsoever, her face entirely composed, describing an act of mercy so extreme and so terrible that the audience finds itself without any emotional framework adequate to contain what it is experiencing. Vincent Price, who appears in the film, stated in interviews conducted later in his career that this particular scene disturbed him more profoundly than anything else he participated in across his entire professional life. The picture earned $3 million in its opening month, and remains among the most emotionally annihilating horror films of its period. Number 7 is The House on Haunted Hill, from 1959. The filmmaker William Castle did not construct a haunted house picture. He constructed an experience designed from its foundation to make the audience doubt the reliability of their own perceptions. Vincent Price portrays Frederick Loren, a wealthy eccentric who extends an offer of $10,000 to 5 individuals willing to remain inside a reportedly haunted property for the duration of a single night. What develops is not a ghost story in any conventional sense, but rather a layered psychological contest in which the genuine source of danger turns out to be not the supernatural environment but the human beings sharing the space. Castle was a filmmaker who found the concept of a film that merely frightened people in a darkened room insufficient to his ambitions. He installed a mechanical system he called Emergo in selected theaters, a network of wires and pulleys capable of sending a luminous skeleton floating above the seated audience at carefully chosen moments during the screening. A number of venues reported audience members sustaining physical injuries in the panic that followed these interventions, and at least 2 locations received formal complaints from patrons who had required medical attention after genuinely concluding that a supernatural presence had entered the room with them. Castle collected every piece of resulting press coverage and incorporated it into the marketing campaign for the next screening. The most psychologically effective sequence in the film centers on a basement containing a tank of acid and the dissolved organic matter it holds. This material was considered sufficiently extreme for its era that British censors required the production to make cuts before they would issue a certificate of release. Even in its original form, the sequence achieves its disturbing effect not through what it displays directly, but through what it implies about the personality of the pleasant and smiling man who had the tank installed in his own basement for his own purposes. Martin Scorsese placed this film on his personal list of the most frightening pictures ever made, and specifically identified the acid sequence as operating at a level of fundamental dread that bypasses the audience's capacity for intellectual self-protection entirely. At number 6 is Night of the Demon, from 1957. This is not a conventional piece of supernatural horror entertainment. It is the experience of existential dread rendered into a physical object. An American psychologist named John Holden travels to England with the intention of publicly dismantling the credibility of a satanic cult and discovers that he has been designated for death by a summoned demonic entity that will arrive to collect him in exactly 3 days. As each rational explanation he attempts to construct falls apart in his hands, his psychological stability begins to deteriorate in a way that the audience experiences alongside him. The director Jacques Turner conducted what became a significant conflict with his producer Hal Chester over the question of whether the demonic entity should ever be made visible on screen. Turner held the position, and subsequent critical opinion has confirmed he was correct, that an invisible threat is immeasurably more frightening than any physical creature the production could manufacture. Chester overruled him on the matter. The result of this disagreement was a compromise in which the entity appears only in brief and partially concealed glimpses, and those glimpses are in practice more disturbing because of how little they reveal than a full disclosure would have been. The sequence most likely to remain with an audience involves the central character being pursued through a woodland at night by a force that cannot be seen but that expresses itself by distorting the physical environment around him, bending trees, generating unnatural air movement, producing sounds at a register that appears to circumvent the ears entirely and register somewhere at the base of the skull. The acoustic design employed in this sequence generated such a convincing atmosphere of dread that a London cinema received formal written complaints about the air conditioning system being operated at an extreme setting during the screening. The air conditioning had not been activated. Martin Scorsese placed this film on a published list of the 11 most frightening pictures ever produced. Stephen King acknowledged that the central device of a curse that can be transferred between people served as direct inspiration for his novelette. Number 5 is Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956, and this is the picture that taught an entire generation of Americans to be afraid of closing their eyes. A small-town physician named Miles Bennell establishes that alien organic pods are producing perfect physical replicas of sleeping human beings, and replacing the originals with duplicates that are externally identical but entirely without emotional life. The film offers its audience no conventional antagonist to identify and confront. The thing that wants to destroy you presents itself wearing the face of your wife. It presents itself wearing the face of your doctor. It presents itself as the uniformed officer you approached because you needed protection. And it registers your existence with complete indifference. The director Don Siegel assembled a political allegory of such precise calibration that both major ideological camps immediately claimed the picture as confirmation of their own position. Those on the political right understood it as a warning about the infiltration of communist influence into American communities. Those on the political left experienced it as a horror story about McCarthyism consuming individual identity. Siegel later acknowledged that his intention had been to disturb both camps equally, and the evidence suggests he succeeded. The studio insisted on the addition of a framing narrative that implied an eventual resolution and rescue. Siegel resisted this intervention and was overruled. Even with this modification in place, the picture proved so effective at generating genuine paranoia that multiple cinemas reported audience members openly accusing one another of being pod replacements following the conclusion of screenings. Mental health professionals began using the phrase body snatcher syndrome to describe patients who presented with the conviction that people close to them had been covertly substituted. The United States Library of Congress designated the film for permanent preservation as a work of cultural significance. Jordan Peele has identified it as the foundational model for horror that achieves genuine and lasting psychological destabilization of its audience. Number 4 is The Bad Seed, from 1956. And this is the picture that altered how parents looked at their own children and left that alteration in place permanently. The actress Patty McCormack delivers what is arguably the most chilling performance by a child in the history of the medium, portraying a girl named Rhoda who is 8 years old, immaculately dressed, perfectly mannered, and entirely without the capacity for remorse, and who kills anyone who creates an obstacle for her without experiencing anything that resembles a human emotional response. The gradual comprehension that slowly overtakes her mother as she arrives at a full understanding of the creature she has been raising becomes one of the most airless and suffocating horror experiences the decade produced. The director Mervyn Leroy engaged in sustained conflict with the studio over the film's foundational premise, which proposed that evil could be a heritable characteristic, that a child could arrive in the world without any capacity for empathy, and that no quantity of love or careful parenting would introduce what was structurally absent. A consulting psychologist warned the production that the picture was capable of causing permanent damage to the way audiences perceived children. Leroy's reported response was that this outcome was exactly what he was working toward. The sequence in this film that disturbs most deeply does not present violence visually, presents it acoustically. The audience hears a man burning to death, his sounds of agony rising and then fading into silence, while the camera remains on Rhoda's face as she arranges her hair with a mild concentration of someone performing a routine task, her expression suggesting something like mild annoyance at a background noise. Multiple cinemas reported physical illness among audience members during this sequence, and the illness was not a response to what they were watching. It was a response to the expression that was not on that child's face. Alfred Hitchcock is reported to have described this film as the most psychologically damaging picture Hollywood had ever released. Stephen King named it as a foundational influence on his own work involving children at the center of horror. The film received 4 nominations from the Academy,